Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Immigration History Research Center virtually this afternoon. My name is Erica Lee, and I'm very happy to host you and to all of our speakers. I'd first like to acknowledge that here at the Immigration History Research Center, our offices are located in Minneapolis, which is located on Dakota land. Today, many Indigenous people, including the Dakota and the Ojibwe from throughout the state of Minnesota, call the Twin Cities home. We at the IHRC acknowledge that the migration and settlement of immigrants and refugees to the United States has been part of the same US settler colonial practices that have displaced and dispossessed Indigenous peoples. We must acknowledge these intersections, the consequences, and the continuing legacies. Today's event is a partnership between the IHRC, Public Books, and the Migration Scholar Collaborative. If you don't know about the Migration Scholar Collaborative, I encourage you to check it out. It is a new hub for scholars in the humanities and the social sciences, where we've gathered virtually to present our work to the larger public, to other scholars, to journalists, to students, lawmakers, and to thought leaders. We strive to decriminalize migration and to open wider pathways to legal immigration in the United States. The Migration Scholar Collaborative began as an effort organized by Professor Elliot Young of Lewis and Clark College. And MISC publishes a newsletter. It helps to bring scholars and advocates together to work on a number of projects. Check out the MISC website for writings by MISC members and for more. There should be a link in the chat box. Today's conversation features a number of scholars who are part of the Migration Scholar Collaborative, many of whom are also either former or current IHRC colleagues as well, and who have written for a special public book series on migration. You'll learn more about that series in a moment. But before we get started, I wanted to highlight a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded, and the question and answer portion will happen in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit questions at any time during our conversation. Don't wait until the very end. We'll turn to audience questions after the formal presentations have ended and after the moderated conversation. You can choose to submit questions anonymously if you do not want to include your name as we read aloud the questions, but do feel free to do this throughout the presentation. We have a number of speakers who are joining us, and I'm first going to introduce our moderator for our event. A. Naomi Paik is an associate professor of criminology, law and justice, and global Asian studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's also the author of a number of books, including Bans, Walls, Raids, Sanctuary, Understanding U.S. Immigration for the 21st Century. It was published in 2020 by UC Press. And there's also the award-winning Rightlessness, Testimony and Redress in U.S. Prison Camps Since World War II, published in 2016. Welcome, Naomi. Thank you so much for helping to organize this event.
Thank you so much, Erica, and thank you so much to the IHRC and to the members of MISC who are here, and also to my co-editors of the Public Books Borderland series, Jerry Cadava and Kat Ramirez. So before I introduce our speakers, I just want to say a little bit about Public Books, which is an open access online magazine where curious readers can discover the leading scholars and experts writing about today's most interesting books, films, media, and cultural events. Specifically, the Borderland series, which, like I said, I co-edit with Jerry Cadava and Kat Ramirez, focuses on urgent issues of migration, borders, borderland cultures, all towards envisioning futures where people have both the freedom to stay where they are and the freedom to move across borders. We're honored to have curated this series From Crisis to Futurity with the Migration Scholars Collaborative and to co-host today's event. And the articles in the From Crisis to Futurity series take various forms, including the manifesto, the interview, the historical essay, and yet they all offer vital historical context for the moment that we are in. They also provide us with urgent political critique and an expansive understanding of all the aspects of life in the United States that immigration affects. So we're focusing today's panel discussion on several essays and contributions that highlight the issues around asylum and refugees. And it is my honor to be introducing all of the scholars today. I will be introducing them right before they speak. And we are going to start off with Rachel Ida Buff and Evan Taparata. So Rachel Ida Buff teaches history and comparative ethnic studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She is author, most recently, of A is for Asylum Seeker, Words for People on the Move. And that was published by Fordham University Press in 2020. She is also the author of Against the Deportation Terror, Organizing for Immigrant Rights in the 20th Century, which was published by Temple University Press in 2017. She co-authored her piece with Evan Taparata, who is a postdoctoral fellow in Global American Studies at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, where he teaches in the Ethnicity, Migration, and Rights program. He is currently working on a fantastic book project based on his award-winning University of Minnesota dissertation about how settler colonialism, slavery and emancipation, and anti-immigrant gatekeeping helped shape ideas and practices of refuge in the United States from the American Revolution to World War II. Definitely look out for this book in the future. He is co-editor of abusablepast.org, the online companion to the Radical History Review. Thank you so much, Rachel and Evan.
Thank you, Naomi.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Naomi, so much for that really generous introduction. And I think, Rachel, we've decided that I'll begin our portion of
historical order. So
yeah, so then I'll start us off, and then I'll be followed up by Rachel's comments. Before I do begin, I just want to say again, thanks to Naomi, and thanks as well to Erica for bringing us all together. It really is such an honor to be in conversation with all of the scholars who are a part of this today. And I'm very grateful as well to be in conversation with those of you who are here in the audience participating in our seminar. Many thanks as well to Pat, Carrie, and Margie, who are keeping things all held together for us behind the scenes. Really appreciate the work you're doing. So I think, in the interest of time, because I don't have a lot of time myself, nor do we have a whole lot of time together as a group today, I'm going to keep my comments fairly brief. What I'd like first to do is just kind of offer a reminder of what our piece that Rachel and I co-authored is about, since it's been a little while since the essay was published in the public book series. And then I would like to offer just one kind of takeaway from the piece that we might think with for the duration of our time together this afternoon. So the article that Rachel and I co-wrote together is called Refuge Denied, Asylum Pending. And it's a big picture historical overview of, on the one hand, the rhetoric of refuge in the United States, and on the other hand, what practices of refuge have actually looked like on the ground throughout United States history. So, many of us, I think, are probably familiar with the big grand boasts that were made in the early national period about the potential of the United States to be a place of refuge. I'm thinking in particular of folks like Thomas Paine, who, in his kind of famous political treatise, Common Sense, described an independent United States as an asylum for all mankind, a place on the world stage where anyone might find sanctuary and asylum from persecution. And in some instances that was true. It seemed that the United States might live up to that promise. For example, in 1798, 150 years before the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, Congress passed a bill that promised tens of thousands of acres of land to displaced Canadians and Nova Scotians who were loyal to the effort of the American Revolution, but were displaced by the British because of their support for the United States. These people were offered, again, thousands of acres of land, and this would seem to be a very kind of generous, gracious form of refuge, but that land was in the Northwest Territory, a part of the new nation the United States was eagerly trying to seize from Native peoples. And so on the one hand, this kind of foundational moment of refugee policy in the United States, yes, it grants refuge and quite a bit of land to displaced peoples, displaced European peoples, but it was also an act of dispossession, part of the broader scheme of US settler colonialism. So our piece really tries to kind of follow through on that kind of context and shows the many ways in which refuge in United States history has been entangled with various efforts of US imperial policy. We track the ways that refuge, more often than not, has been used towards instrumental ends, refuge being offered conditionally rather than unconditionally, and in ways that meet the interests of the United States as those interests evolved over time. That's really, in the big picture, what our piece was about. With the flip side of that, of course, being the latter half focusing on many ways in which migrants, asylum seekers, and their allies have all tried to, despite the United States so rarely following through on its promises to offer refuge, these groups seeking to make the US live up to its promise as a place of refuge by demanding asylum and by crossing borders. So yes, I think keeping all that in mind, if I could maybe just point us to one kind of takeaway for the article that we might think about. And it's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. Certainly, as I wrote the piece with Rachel, but also in recent weeks and months as well. This takeaway revolves around the kind of framing of the refugee crisis itself. So we so often see in the media, this term refugee crisis, which is often accompanied by imagery of many people, faceless people, whose stories aren't shared, and who are presented as, kind of masses who nation states need to rescue. This is a clearly problematic representation of refugees, and many scholars have written about that. But the one thing that I think about a lot in relation to the work that I do and in relation to the conversations we're trying to raise with this piece is I think about a reframing of not so much thinking about the refugee crisis, but a refuge crisis, a crisis of refuge, one in which nation states, in the present certainly, but historically as well, have failed to meet the interests and needs of refugees. I think one of the things our piece does is make the argument that the United States has always been in this crisis of refuge. The United States has always, had a lot of rhetoric that promises refuge, but has never actually lived up to that promise. And on the other hand, it's a crisis of refuge again, in the sense that despite the United States and other nation states' failings in actually following through on an actual realized practice of unconditional refuge, migrants themselves are doing incredible work, incredible forms of solidarity, and trying to make nation states open their doors. And so I think for me, that's maybe, I see I'm at about 6 minutes. I think I might just leave it there with that kind of raising that kind of question of shifting the frame a bit from a refugee crisis to a crisis of refuge, and what that might do for us as we think about the history of US refugee policy, especially from the kind of intersection of settler colonialism, the history of slavery and emancipation, and the history of US xenophobia more broadly. Rachel, do you want to go ahead and take it away for the remainder of our time?
I'll take it away for a while, and then maybe you can take it back. So yeah, thanks to everybody. I'm so pleased and privileged to be a member of MIGSE and to be writing with Evan and to be here at IHRC. Thank you, Naomi and Jerry and Kat and Erica. And I should say that I'm coming to you from the lands of, well, I'm not going to even recite all the tribes and nations that have lived here, because what I always say about Milwaukee is it has always been a cosmopolitan place. It has been an indigenous cosmopolitan place, and now there are many other nations here with all that entails for both good and bad. I guess I want to say also that I'm so happy to write with Evan, because I think all the time about early America, but I'm a historian of the 20th century. I teach the first part of the survey just because it's like this exotic, interesting space to work out the things I think about all the time in the 20th century. So it was such a privilege to write with Evan. And one of the things Evan and I do really well together is we don't necessarily plan things, but we're often thinking about the same thing. So we have this like, psychic historical connection, because I want to talk too about this whole narrative of crisis from a slightly different angle, but I think it's compatible with what Evan was starting us off on. And what I really like about the piece as it came together, with our both sort of very different expertise and perspectives, was we really, I think, show that there has been one long crisis of refuge and refugees since, I don't know, 1789, 1690, 1619. We can't say that name anymore. 1619, we can't say that word. We have to skip it. But anyway, it's been a long crisis. And I think what that tells us is the narrative of crisis is sometimes deliberately, but always purposively ahistorical. So I wanted to talk about a couple of moments sort of in the 20th century that particularly draw my attention in thinking about this. And then I want to return at the end to some earlier antecedents that I think might help us think about things. So, I point out in my part of the piece that, the UN High Commission on Refugees meets in 1951 and sort of first legislates in international law. Of course, the term refugee and the idea of refugee is much older, but, this notion of an international refugee regime. And that is picked up to some degree in the United States in the McCarran-Walter legislation and recognized and mostly used for Cold War purposes, which is something that I think Evan's work does really beautifully, is talk about the ways in which narratives of refuge and harbor are always part of empire building. So at the very moment that, this is being ratified internationally and gaining kind of a limited traction in the United States. We don't really sign off on things until 1967. And our colleague Carl Linskog explores really beautifully the ways in which after the Refugee Act of 1980, he has State Department operatives digging for a way to, not give refuge to Haitians before the ink is dry on that bill. So, it's kind of always a conflict, but that gets authorized in 1951 by the UN, in 1952 by McCarran-Walter, and this is at the exact same time historically that we see the ascendance of Operation Wetback from the Immigration and Naturalization Service. So for a long time, I thought about it in a kind of bifurcated way, like, well, there's refugee policy, and that is always comes at sort of the expense of someone. So at the same time, there's a category of migrants who tend in this formulation to be white, European, fleeing communist folks. At the same time, there are bad illegals who are going to be demonized by Operation Wetback, right? And I think we need to think about that as always being the crisis, right? At the same moment that there's kind of reparative action, there's always going to be marginalizing action. I think Carl's work shows that. I think our article shows that. I think the kind of historical collision of the ascendance of refugees and the denigration of so-called illegals, and I document in Against the Deportation Terror that it's Operation Wetback, its enduring accomplishment is to popularize this term illegal alien in the press. I even have like a teeny bit of quantitative analysis, which is not usually my milieu, but like to say that like references to this term just really go through the sky at this time. Okay, I'm getting text from Naomi that it's time to wrap up. So I'm gonna wrap up and just say one of the things I really like about being in dialogue with an early Americanist, as someone who thinks a lot about histories of sanctuary and practices of sanctuary, is I think it might be really useful for us to repurpose a term that's often used in studies of the Caribbean and the Americas, a maroon community or a quilombo, because I think what we see in response to these crises, these perennial crises at the border, the Haitians now, Central Americans, the multinational universe of people that exist trying to get into the United States at the US-Mexican border right now, I think that that's best described as sort of practices that are outside of the state. and outside of any state where refuges are being created by runaways and vagabonds and people who are excluded. So I'm gonna wrap it up there.
Okay, thank you both so much for your fabulous comments. I already have so many questions that I want to ask. So, but thank you so much. And thank you so much for your contribution to the series overall. So I encourage everyone to take a look at their piece. I think all of the pieces are really great for teaching because they're very succinct, but also have a kind of breadth and depth that you don't always find in very short pieces. So thank you both, Rachel and Evan, for your contributions. So next we're going to turn to Lynn Stevens. And Lynn Stevens is the Philip H. Knight Chair and Distinguished Professor of Arts and Sciences, a professor of anthropology, and a participating faculty member in Indigenous, Race and Ethnic Studies, Latin American Studies, and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Oregon. Her latest books include Stories That Make History, Mexico through Elena Poniatowski's Chronicas, which was published by Duke University Press in 2021, and Indigenous Women and Violence, Feminist Active Research in Heightened States of Injustice, co-edited with Shannon Speed, which was published by the University of Arizona Press in 2021. Okay, so thank you so much, Lynn. I look forward to your comments.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to IHRC and Public Books. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, to get started. So my piece was titled Rethinking Asylum, Let Families and Communities Seek Asylum Together. And one of the points of the piece is really looking at all the different reasons why people flee and seek asylum, including food insecurity, poverty, crop failure, as well as violence. And I'm going to speak through my work in Central America, Guatemala. I've done a lot of work with Guatemalan asylees, also Mexican asylees, primarily indigenous. And I've also done research among those populations in Mexico, in Guatemala, here, and in US Immigration Court. So if we look at displacements in Guatemala, we can see we have disaster displacements. We also have conflict and violence displacements, about 500,000 just for the last calendar year. There are drug trafficking routes that go through Central America, through quite a number of the communities I work in. That involve not only organized crime, but also involve sort of state agents linked to these trafficking routes that could include local authorities, mayors, military officials, and police, and also sort of subcontracting to local gangs. So there's a very complex sort of militarized and paramilitarized terrain that people are living in, as well as being in a dry corridor where corn farming and other kinds of crops just have really decreased in relation to climate crisis. If we look at pending immigration cases for Guatemala, we can see there's almost 300,000 out of a total of about 1.5 million pending immigration cases. That includes a lot of asylum cases. The average wait time for a case to be heard is 926 days. Just in the state of Oregon, there's now about 3,700 cases. Many people are familiar with this recent statistic of almost 2 million US Customs and Border Patrol enforcement actions on the border. A lot of these, of course, are people who are repeatedly trying to come into the US. So this does not represent the number of individuals, but the number of attempts. As of May 2021, there were more than 20,000 Guatemalan children on the US-Mexico border, and Mexico is deporting hundreds of people each day over its southern border to Guatemala and remote areas such as El Cebo, which is here, which is a very remote border crossing. And there's nothing there. So I want to sort of talk about how we need to really look at climate change, human movement, policies of extraction, capitalism, and war and the impact on our planet, and look at that in relation to foreign policy, development policy, climate policy, and what we call immigration policy, but which our previous speakers have pointed out is much more. Many of the people that I've been working with as an expert witness and as a researcher have fled violence in Central America tied to US supportive authoritarian regimes. And this migration and movement inside of Guatemala, from Guatemala to Mexico and up into the US, is tied to these wars and the US support of these regimes during this war. There's a picture of Ronald Reagan meeting with Guatemalan dictator Efrain Rios Montt, who was convicted of genocide in Guatemala that was later overturned. So a lot of people say, well, why don't people come legally to the US? You could come through family unification, through an employment visa, or a humanitarian visa. Now in 2020, the US capped official refugee resettlement at 18,000. That figure is significantly bigger this year, but even if it was double, triple, 10 times, it would never meet the 26 million refugees who are looking for refuge around the world. And just Mexico alone, for example, in 2018 had 1 million, about 260,000 applicants on a waiting list for an immigrant visa to the US. And depending on what kind of visa people apply for, that wait could be 20, 22 years, even longer. We continue to see limits on asylum imposed by the Trump administration that still exist, remain in Mexico in metering, militarization of Mexican borders, Mexico increasing detention and deportation, really working for the US, Title 42, not letting people in to request asylum, removing them immediately, and deporting people directly to Guatemala, Haiti, and other Central American countries. As Ida pointed out, our refugee convention is from 1951. The US did not sign on until 1967. And asylum can be granted in the US if an applicant can demonstrate as an individual that they have a past or well-founded fear of persecution on 5 grounds: membership in a social group, religion, race, nationality, or political opinion. And what I want us to get to think about is how we really have to link our policy about asylum to the real world of those who are on the borders trying to get in. Asylum should pertain not just to individuals fleeing persecution, but also to networks of people who are connected in daily life. As I started out saying, violence, poverty, climate change, and unemployment are experienced collectively in communities. Families and communities flee together, and they all also reconstitute themselves as collective social bodies in the US. So does every asylum seeker in a violent, chaotic, impoverished, very difficult situation have to make their own case, like drip, drip from the faucet? Or could the US begin actively designating regions worthy of asylum and enabling families and communities to leave? One of the things I've been studying here in Oregon has been responses to COVID in farm worker communities, which also includes quite a few asylum seekers. I also often talk with folks through my work as an expert witness. And what we found in interviewing about 300 people, and I've done follow-up interviews with about 20 folks, primarily mom from Guatemala, is people have had difficulty paying their rent, they've lost wages, they have trouble feeding their family and sending their families back home, who are also suffering from COVID and economic loss. But what's incredible is folks with or without asylum here in the US are actively constructing networks of care. Couldn't we support and build on that? Biden has a plan. Kamala Harris has been to Guatemala to look at the root causes of migration. But a lot of what's being offered are sort of policies of the past that really don't address the complex challenges in Central America. So what should we do? We can greatly expand legal paths of immigration. We can greatly expand the number of refugees admitted from different countries. We can update the asylum system to allow people to receive asylum in extended family groups and communities. We can support reunification with networks of already established groups of people from the same communities and regions. And we can design climate, foreign, refugee, and immigration policy together. There's a really great book by Karthik Ramakrishnan and Alan Coburn called Citizenship Reimagined, which also has a lot of ideas that I won't go into about ways to work at the state level and locally. So this is a quote from an article called The Great Climate Migration. In 2070, about 19% of the world's population may live in a barely livable hot zone. Billions of people call this home. Where will they go? Well, most of us who research refugees know that people first move internally to cities, then they try to leave their country's borders. And every year, more and more will try to get into the US, into the European Union, or elsewhere. Climate change is global. Human smuggling networks are global. Human movement is global. Immigration and refugee policy is national and extremely limited. I think we can do better. So I hope we can dream big and think out of the box. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you so much for your contributions. So next up, our final two speakers are Josie Saldana and Laura Briggs. So Professor Maria Josefina Saldana Portillo is affiliated with the Social and Cultural Analysis Department and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU. Her most recent award-winning book is Indian Given: Racial Geographies Across Mexico and the United States, which was published by Duke University Press in 2016. Laura Briggs is professor of women, gender, sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and former chair both there and in gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona. She is the author most recently of Taking Children, A History of American Terror, which was published in 2020, and How All Politics Became Reproductive Politics, from Welfare Reform to Foreclosure to Trump, published in 2016, and both of those are available from University of California Press. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Naomi. And also, of course, Jerry and Kat for organizing the book series. Laura and I wanted to speak towards the gendered nature of both the push factors of migration as well as the pull factors of migration, and talk about them in perhaps ways that reflect the way in which the United States really is responsible for a lot of this migration that we're seeing today, in the ways that Lynn just addressed, and especially specifically regarding the exporting on the one hand of the Maras, which are gangs that began in the United States, and thanks to deportation policies in 1996, that the IRA Act ended up deporting close to 300,000 former gang members that had committed crimes in the United States, who were deported to what we call the Northern Triangle: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And from working with these women who do come into the refugee centers, I detected a pattern of the kinds of violence that are inflicted on these women and cause them to flee by the Maras, by both the Mara Salvatrucha and the Barrio 18, which you might recognize as MS-13 and MS-19. So they are they work for cartels in trafficking drugs, but they also have to sustain themselves as gangs. So they have all forms of sustaining themselves, and a principal form is imposing taxes on women with small businesses in their homes or in the marketplace, like small dining halls or small bodegas, they like selling stuff. And so there's a regular pattern where the Maras will tax these women, and eventually the taxes will get so high that the women can't, they call them taxes, they're like whatever protection payments, and they'll get so high that eventually the women can't pay them. And then eventually it will escalate to asking for sexual favors from either the women or usually their daughters. There's also a lot of reproductive labor that these women do for the gangs, obviously coerced into doing it. In addition to sexual labor, they have to do like cleaning, feeding. These Maras are kids from the neighborhood, and so they'll come into people's homes and demand to be fed, or they'll come into people's homes and use the homes of these women as drug depots. And what eventually makes women flee is the threat of sexual violence to themselves or to their children. But rather than see this as exceptional, we really wanted to show how this form of feminized labor under coercion, this kind of gendered violence, is a large part of the reason why these women flee, but also maintains the structure of the drug economy and the gang economy in Central America. So it was very important for us to highlight the gendered aspects of this flight and what makes them come. And women in Central America will tolerate an extraordinary amount of violence. It's the tipping point is always the threat of sexual violence to themselves or their female children that ends up sending them here. And oftentimes that violence, that they've already experienced that violence, they've already been forced into concubinage, or their daughters have been forced into concubinage, or they're about to experience it, and so they'll flee. And there's this very recurrent pattern. So we wanted to look at the under-researched or unseen role that women's domestic labor plays in what is in effect supporting our own drug consumption in this country, because these the Maras do work for the cartels and transporting the drugs, which leads to this kind of standardization of domestic labor in the reproduction of drug consumption, of which the United States is the ultimate destination. I only have 29 seconds left, so I'm going to pass the ball to Laura.
So what I want to add is just that this experience of sexual violence, or the threat of sexual violence, doesn't end once people cross the border into the United States. There's a structure of description in which people are unsafe in Central America or Mexico, and then the United States becomes the place of refuge and safety. And of course, that's not the case, as we know too well. Every year, the Department of Homeland Security receives thousands of complaints of sexual violence, harassment, and abuse, mostly involving women, children, queer, and trans people in detention. The primary perpetrators are guards and Border Patrol agents, and the less than 1% of these are investigated by the US federal government. And understand that this is, of course, a ridiculous undercount, because these are people who believe enough in the system to say, and somebody's going to protect me if I complain. And any retaliation or harassment I receive as a result of complaining will be worth it, because something better will happen. And I just want to, I also want to say briefly that, of course, much of the labor that immigrant and refugee women and feminized people find once they get to the US is often as nannies, domestic workers, and home health aides, working in homes where, again, they report incredibly high rates of sexual violence and sexual abuse and very little protection. And so I'll stop there, and we can turn it back to Naomi.
Right. Thank you both so much. I feel like I could listen to all of our panelists just talk for hours because I'm already learning so much just from reading your work and then also being in conversation with you. So I do want to remind folks who are on the call that you can post a question to us at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I wanted to pull out, before we turn to the audience, I want to pull out a couple of themes that I saw, or certain things that came out and stood out to me. With Evan and Rachel, your insistence that we don't have a refugee crisis so much as we have a refuge crisis. And I think what I'm sort of hearing you, I think Evan said this, but I'm sort of hearing you riff off of Harsha Walia's insistence that we don't have a migration crisis, we have an imperialism crisis. And so I think this also speaks to the demand that we examine the root causes of asylum seeking, of the creation of refugees, and of migration overall, as Lynn and basically all of you have been pointing out. And so when we're talking about root causes, we are not talking about them a la Kamala Harris, who's basically like, don't come, right? And who is only willing to look at root causes insofar as it doesn't implicate US imperialism. Like you actually can't look at root causes without looking at forces of imperialism. I think for Laura and Josie, what really stands out to me is how even just regular US people in the US are implicated in the violence that creates people to be forced to move, right? So I think, Josie, your point that we aren't only just not seeing the role of women's domestic labor in supporting the Maras, right? Their coerced sexual labor, their coerced domestic labor, the offering of food, things like this. But these women's domestic labor is supporting our own drug consumption in the United States. And I think that is kind of revelatory for me. And I think also what I appreciate so much about Laura and Josie's contribution is that you're looking at gendered violence on both sides of the migration experience. And this focus on gender really exposes how the US is never a place of refuge or safety, depending on what kind of person is seeking refuge and safety. And I think the long history that Evan and Rachel point out showed us that, again, going back to some of what you've already said, none of this is exceptional. This is actually who we are. This is actually who we have always been. We provide refuge for certain others in a nationalist kind of viewpoint, right? We provide refuge as long as it does something for the US interests. So I think your example about giving refuge to Canadian refugees, also in part as a way to displace Indigenous nations in the Northwest Territories, is very instructive for that. So these are some of the things that I came up, so that stood out for me. And finally, this is something that I'm really interested in, but I really appreciate, Rachel, your turning us to the Quilombo and Maroon communities as an alternate way of thinking about refuge and asylum in a way that is absolutely insisting on its disaggregation from the state. We have to divorce the state if we want to actually provide refuge and sanctuary to others. And I think it also, you're turning us to the Quilombo and Maroon communities also points us to the Black radical tradition. And so I'm wondering what, one of the kind of big picture questions for me is how does putting Indigenous displacement and the fact that, as Erica noted in the introduction to the whole event today, how does indigeneity, Indigenous sovereignty, migration, the implication of migration in settler colonialism, and then also how are there different threads that we can take from Black radical traditions in order to rethink what asylum actually means and what refuge could actually look like. So those are just some opening thoughts. I want to open it up to you. First of all, if you have questions for each other, if you have responses to the different threads that have come up, and then we'll also look for our audience members' questions in the meantime. But I want to open it up to you first.
I appreciate where you ended up in terms of indigeneity. And one of the most interesting conversations I've been a part of is with Indigenous asylum seekers who are also working as farm workers. They're putting a lot of food on our table, probably, 40, 50% in the West Coast are Indigenous. And not talking about not wanting to be labeled as immigrants, not wanting to be labeled as Latinx, and really wanted to be seen as indigenous communities in diaspora, but in Turtle Island, in this greater territory, having much longer relations that exist outside of settler colonialism and Spanish colonialism. So I think some of those perspectives and tools are really useful, as well as, which allows us to disconnect from modern states and the histories that these communities have of building refuge, of actually moving. Movement, diaspora is a part of life, and looking at that as resources. And what I was talking about was the incredible care building networks that, for example, Guatemalan indigenous refugees have been building despite not having access to any services, not getting in the door for asylum, both here in the US and back in their home communities. So I think pushing it out in those ways, I really appreciate. Thank you.
I'll just add that the exported problem of the Maras to Central America, the U.S. caused problem, is also really affecting indigenous communities. Indigenous communities in Guatemala, for example, are very good at keeping the Maras out, but constantly that means that certain people are targeted. I've seen a number of cases, as part of this expert witness network that we form, where especially literate Maya or literate Garifuna, people who could be mediators between the Maras and their indigenous communities and potentially infiltrate those indigenous communities in that way, are themselves target for violence. And so we've been actually successful in emphasizing their indigenous character as part of why they're being targeted.
Language is part of the problem here. Like if we think about indigenous dispossession, 1400 to the present, indigenous dispossession causes migration. It's causing migration right now. Resource despoliation, water, environmental degradation. That's why people are leaving Central America and Haiti. And that we don't think of those people as indigenous, but as migrants, gives us these weird conceptual problems when, as has been pointed out by our colleagues, that's a lot of who's leaving, and that's why they're leaving. And, I think as a person trained as a US historian, we're willfully myopic about these things. The language misleads us.
Okay, I want to turn to one of our questions in the Q&A. Erica, did you want to jump in? I saw you put your
I'd be happy to jump in.
Okay, please.
I had a couple of different questions like you. I was fiercely jotting down ideas and comments and doing all of the arrows and things like that. And I also want to join in the psychic historical connection with all of you. But I did want to pick up on something that Evan and Rachel mentioned at the beginning, and then something that you, Naomi, just mentioned at the end. And again, I also wanted to add my appreciation for the different framing. I always hate the crisis language. If they're manufactured crises, the language is used to divide, to politicize, to demonize. And so shifting that frame onto us, where we are the ones manufacturing this crisis of welcome or of refuge, I think is super important. I also, I think Rachel is starting to talk about the framing of crisis language, but also how it's used to uplift certain groups as the good ones, the welcomed ones, the refugees, the deserving, while denigrating the others, right? And so in my mind, I was thinking about just a month ago or 2 months ago, almost simultaneously, the patriotic welcome of Afghani refugees at the same time as the violence on the border, and just seeing this pattern repeat, right, from so many other eras that we've known about. So one question is, I mean, these are all like large philosophical, but also political / scholarly questions, right? How do we help? How do we use our own scholarly research, teaching, advocacy work to bridge that divide? You know, to call attention, right, to the ways in which this good / bad is overwhelmingly damaging without jeopardizing, right, the limited and precarious moments when Americans as a whole, as well as our state functioning government, is seeming to move towards, you know, an organized resettlement process. So that's one big question. And then the other one is, you know, MISC was formed at a time when we thought that we thought we'd be in a different place, you know, 5 months, whatever, how many months in, I've lost track of time. But clearly immigration reform is not happening. And so I had this question from another, on another panel, from a policymaker, someone who's in the trenches, like literally meeting with politicians every day. And basically, you know, is this a time when we're willing to accept the tiny incremental crumbs on immigration actions in the face of nothing else happening? Or, you know, when do we hold out? When do we hold out for larger overarching, and I hate to use the reform, let's just say action, change. And I just feel like we are in this moment where it's extremely discouraging to think about what's happening at the federal level. So I don't know, this is like therapy for me, help with these two big questions.
I think Laura, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to jump on the tail end of Erica's question. And I suppose, in a sense, I'm going to refuse to answer it because I understand that there are political situations that make this moment unmovable, and they are both Democrat and Republican. But I just want to say, I want to give up this framing that we know what this moment is, and this moment is really conservative and conservatizing. This is the first time in decades and decades that Gallup polls find that the US publics think we're not admitting enough refugees and we're not admitting enough immigrants. This is also we're in the middle of a labor crisis. I can't walk down Main Street without seeing 15 signs asking for entry-level workers. And so, I mean, there's, on the one hand, what we know about this moment, which is what people want and what politicians are able to produce are two completely different things, whether the subject is roads and bridges or immigration reform. And I am not by temperament suited to being a politician. And so I continued to refuse the terms of why people can't move, especially when we keep saying that Democrats and Republicans are stalemated, but they don't have any trouble at all voting ever larger budgets for the military completely unanimously, and in fact, more than they are asked for. So I don't buy that we're stalemated. I don't buy that this is a bad moment.
I wanted to turn to one of the questions that we've gotten in the Q&A, and I apologize that we're only going to get to one because of time constraints. But this one is from Elliot Young, our fearless leader of MISC. And it's specifically directed at Laura. I appreciate your tracking violence across the borders, and I think Josie, across the borders into the United States. But of course, an asylum claim can only be successful if the argument can be made that the government complicity in violence is worse in the places migrants are coming from. So my question as an Elliot is, how can we keep track of violence in the US while also recognizing different country conditions in the US and Central America?
So a couple of things. I want to remind us that asylum claims were not always individual and one by one, actually, as Lynn said. And so the danger of so many scholars of migration working on migration cases in this one by one thing is that we begin to accept the premise of them, which as historians, we just don't have to. And I also think that clearly there are a great many people migrating from Central America that believe that conditions are much worse in Guatemala in particular, but the Northern Triangle in general. And I'm certainly not arguing against that. But I also think that, again, the danger of the asylum process is that we accept an exoticizing take on where violence is and what violence is. And I think that so much of the violence, as Josie was pointing out, originates in the United States in one way or another, and that we don't have to look south of the border at what Valencia calls the gore of Mexico and say that belongs somehow innately to Latin America. It belongs to transnational capitalism and a transnational political formation. But I'll turn it over to my compatriots.
Actually, I think since we're near the end of our time together, I'm going to ask for just any closing remarks or comments. And I apologize to those who posted questions in the Q&A function that we did not get to. Naomi, do you want to take us out? And then I'll end with a final word from the IHRC.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone, everyone who's here on this call in our audience. And I also want to thank all of our speakers and contributors to the public book series. Thank you all so much for your work and for your insights. I've already learned so much from this conversation, even though I worked with you on the essays. And I really do appreciate all of you emphasizing that we can't turn to the state for asylum. And so if asylum is possible at all, we all have to contribute to creating that and making that happen. We have to care for each other instead. So I do hope that you in the audience will take another look at the From Crisis to Futurity series, as well as forthcoming contributions to public books, and also keep an eye out for more IHRC events, some of which we hope will also feature other contributors from that series from this. So thank you all so much.
Yes, and thank you everyone from me and the IHRC. We are in the midst of planning 2 more MISC events for next semester. In the meantime, do check out the public book series and the IHRC's Immigrants in COVID America project. We also contributed an essay to the series, but our project team also just published 2 research spotlights, one on vaccine equity and another one on the pandemic in detention centers. So thank you again, everyone. Stay well, stay safe, and thank you again for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. I have to run. Thank you so